Sergeant Ava Johnson stood at the airport terminal, her body weary, but her heart fluttering with anticipation. The long months in Afghanistan had been brutal, grueling missions, endless days in the desert heat, the constant stress of combat weighing her down. She had endured it all, not just for herself, but for her team, for her country. And now, finally, she was heading home. Clutching her boarding pass, Ava's eyes scanned the crowd. The noise of the bustling terminal surrounded her. Families reuniting, the chatter of travelers, and the overhead announcements calling passengers to their gates. Despite the chaos, Ava felt an odd sense of peace wash over her. After everything, she was almost home. The thought of seeing her family again, their smiling faces, their open arms waiting for her, brought a small, tired smile to her lips. She shifted the weight of her duffel bag, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders from months of carrying her gear across foreign soil. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but her heart was light with the knowledge that soon she would be with the people she loved most in the world. Just then, the overhead speakers crackled to life. Now boarding first class for Flight 237 to Chicago. Ava blinked in surprise. First class? She fumbled with her boarding pass, double-checking it. She hadn't paid for a first-class seat, had she? No, it was an upgrade, an unexpected bit of luck. She wasn't about to question it. As she made her way down the jet bridge, her mind wandered to thoughts of her family. She imagined her mother's warm embrace, her father's proud smile, and her younger brother Ethan, already showing off the new skills he had learned while she was away. It had been 6 long months since she had seen them, and the idea of being wrapped in their love again filled her with a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in months. When she stepped onto the plane, the familiar smell of recycled air hit her, a strange reminder that despite everything, she was back in the world she once knew. The first-class cabin gleamed with polished surfaces and soft plush seats, a stark contrast to the cramped military transport she had grown used to. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," the flight attendant greeted her with a kind smile. "Your seat is 2A, just to your left." Ava nodded her thanks, still feeling a little out of place. She wasn't used to such luxury, but she wasn't going to complain. As she stowed her small backpack in the overhead compartment, she sank into the large, comfortable seat, relishing the extra legroom. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could stretch out, relax, and breathe. As other passengers began filing in, Ava closed her eyes, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. The hum of the engines, the soft rustle of luggage being stored, and the quiet conversations around her faded into the background. For the first time in months, she felt like she could finally let her guard down. But just as she was starting to drift into a light doze, a sharp voice broke through her moment of tranquility. "Excuse me." Ava's eyes snapped open. Standing in the aisle was a man in his 50s, dressed sharply in a suit. His expression was tight with disapproval, his lips pressed into a thin line as his eyes roamed over her. His gaze lingered on her uniform, his frown deepening. "I believe you're in my seat," he said, his voice clipped and cold. Ava straightened in her seat, her heart sinking. She had seen that look before, more times than she cared to remember. The assumption, the judgment, all because of her uniform and her appearance. "I'm sorry, sir," Ava said, keeping her voice calm and steady. "But this is my assigned seat." She reached for her boarding pass, just to confirm. The man's frown deepened further, his voice growing sharper. "This is first class. There must be some mistake." The implication was clear, and Ava felt that familiar knot form in her stomach. She had faced prejudice before, both in and out of uniform, but it never got easier. She glanced at her boarding pass once more, the reality of the situation settling in. She was right, and yet somehow this confrontation felt inevitable. Ava could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, the silent tension in the air growing thicker with every second. The man standing before her, with his expensive suit and hardened gaze, clearly wasn't backing down. His tone had the unmistakable edge of entitlement, as if simply seeing her in that seat challenged his entire worldview. "There's no mistake," Ava said, keeping her voice measured and calm as she handed him her boarding pass. "This is my assigned seat, 2A." The man snatched the ticket from her hand, his eyes narrowing as he scanned it. His lips thinned even further, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might throw the boarding pass back at her. Instead, he stared at it, incredulous. "This is first class," he repeated, as if those words alone should make her reconsider her very existence in that space. Ava held his gaze, her expression neutral, though inside, her heart was pounding. She'd faced this kind of confrontation before, whether it was because she was a woman, black, or a soldier. It wasn't always easy to tell what triggered the reactions, but over the years she had grown accustomed to the mix of surprise, disbelief, and sometimes outright hostility. She'd learned to stay calm, to let their words slide off her, but it never stopped stinging. The flight attendant, sensing the growing tension, quickly stepped in. Her professional smile stayed firmly in place as she glanced between the two of them. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. The man, clearly emboldened by the arrival of a perceived ally, turned to her with an indignant look. "Yes, there is. This woman claims to have a first-class ticket, but there must be some sort of mistake. This is my seat." The flight attendant raised her eyebrows slightly, then took the boarding pass from his hand. She glanced at it briefly before handing it back, her smile still unwavering. "Everything appears to be in order, sir. Sergeant Johnson is assigned to seat 2A. The man's face flushed an angry shade of red. "This is unacceptable. I paid for a first-class ticket, and I won't have my flight ruined by—" "Sir," the flight attendant interrupted, her voice firm but calm. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Sergeant Johnson has a valid first-class ticket, and she has every right to be here. Please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." The man opened his mouth to argue further, but one glance at the flight attendant's unyielding expression seemed to silence him. With one last glare in Ava's direction, he snatched his bag from the aisle and stormed down toward his seat in economy, grumbling under his breath the entire way. Ava exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. She could feel the stares from the other passengers, some curious, some sympathetic, and others simply uncomfortable. It wasn't the first time she'd been in this kind of situation, but that didn't make it any easier. Each time, it chipped away at her a little more, reminding her that despite everything she'd accomplished, there were still people who saw her as less than. The flight attendant turned to Ava, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry about that, Sergeant. Can I get you anything before we take off?" Ava shook her head, offering a polite smile. "No, thank you. I'm fine." The flight attendant gave her a nod before moving on to help other passengers. Ava stared out the window, her mind still buzzing with the confrontation. She'd been prepared for her return home to be filled with warmth and relief, but this wasn't the welcome back she had hoped for. Her thoughts drifted back to her time in Afghanistan. She had faced dangers far worse than an angry passenger, bullets, explosions, the constant threat of death lurking around every corner. But in some strange way, this kind of encounter felt more personal, more unsettling. Out there, in the desert, her uniform had united her with her fellow soldiers, regardless of race, gender, or background. But here, on this plane, her uniform had become a target. Ava glanced toward the back of the plane, where the man had taken his seat. He was staring at her again, though his expression was less angry now, more puzzled, maybe even ashamed. She wondered what was going through his mind. Was he reconsidering his assumptions? Or was he still seething, unable to accept the reality that someone like her had earned a place in first class? As the plane taxied down the runway, Ava tried to push the encounter from her mind. She was almost home. That was what mattered. She thought about her family waiting for her in Chicago, the hugs and smiles that awaited her, and the comfort of being surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. But as much as she tried to focus on the good, the weight of the confrontation still lingered. It wasn't just about the man in the suit. It was about all the moments like this one. Moments where people had questioned her worth, her abilities, her right to be where she was. It was about the prejudice she had faced as a woman of color in the military, the constant need to prove herself over and over again. Ava's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt of turbulence, shaking the plane briefly. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, and the passengers around her tensed, their conversations halting as the plane shuddered. She tightened her grip on the armrests, her military training kicking in as she remained calm. This was nothing compared to the chaos she had faced overseas, but the unease in the cabin was palpable. Across the aisle, she noticed an elderly woman gripping her seat, her knuckles white with fear. "It's okay," Ava said softly, leaning toward the woman. "Turbulence is normal. Just take deep breaths." The woman looked at her with wide eyes, clearly trying to calm herself. Ava continued to speak in a soothing voice, offering words of reassurance until the plane steadied again. Slowly, the tension in the cabin eased and conversations resumed. The elderly woman offered Ava a small, grateful smile, and Ava nodded in return. As the plane settled back into its steady course, Ava leaned back in her seat, her thoughts returning to the man in the back of the plane. She hadn't meant to get involved in the turbulent situation, but it was second nature to her now, to lead, to calm, to take charge when others were afraid. It was something she had learned in the military, something that had become a part of her. And it was something that, perhaps, the man in the suit hadn't expected from someone like her. She glanced down at the small notebook in her lap. Writing had always helped her process her thoughts, especially after a long mission or a difficult day. Maybe it could help her now, too. She opened the notebook, her pen hovering over the blank page. She wasn't sure where to start. This letter wasn't about anger. It was about understanding, about bridging the gap between her world and his. Ava's pen hovered over the blank page for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts. What could she possibly say to someone like Mark? She didn't want to lash out in anger. It wouldn't help either of them. But there was so much to say, so much to explain. She needed him to understand that his assumptions about her were wrong, that people like her, women, people of color, soldiers, had earned their place in the world through hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. Ava wasn't interested in proving her worth to him, but she wanted to challenge his view of the world, even if it was just for a moment. "Dear sir," she began again, her pen moving slowly at first, then gaining speed as her thoughts started to flow. "I know you may have made assumptions about me when you saw me sitting in that first-class seat. Maybe you thought I didn't belong there, that I hadn't earned my place. But I'd like to share a little about myself because sometimes understanding someone's story can change your perspective." Ava paused, thinking about the right way to explain her journey without turning it into a lecture. She didn't want to sound accusatory or bitter. She wanted to speak from the heart, to make Mark see her as a person, not just a uniform or a stranger in his way. She continued writing, explaining how she had spent the last 6 months in Afghanistan, serving her country alongside men and women from all walks of life. She told him about the bonds she had formed with her fellow soldiers. People like Emma Lopez, who had saved her life during an ambush outside Kabul. Ava had never forgotten that day, how they had been surrounded, bullets whizzing past them, the dust and chaos blurring their vision. Emma had acted quickly, pulling Ava to safety, and in that moment, it hadn't mattered what they looked like, where they came from, or what language they spoke. They were family. In the military, we learn to rely on each other, to trust each other without question. We come from different backgrounds, different races, different parts of the country. But when we're out there, none of that matters. We're a team. We're united by our mission and our commitment to each other. She thought back to the countless nights she had spent in the desert, staring up at the stars, wondering what her life would be like when she returned home. Those moments of quiet reflection had given her perspective, helped her understand that the world was bigger than any one person's beliefs or assumptions. In the military, she had learned that true strength came not from standing alone, but from standing together. As she wrote, memories of her deployment flooded her mind. Long nights on patrol, the weight of her gear pressing down on her shoulders, the adrenaline-fueled rush of missions where life and death hung in the balance. But amid all that chaos and fear, there had been moments of profound beauty, moments where humanity had shone through, even in the darkest of times. Ava continued writing, her pen flying across the page. When I'm in uniform, people sometimes make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am based on what they see. But the truth is, my uniform doesn't define me. It's part of who I am, yes, but there's so much more to my story. I've seen the best and worst of humanity in my time overseas, and I've learned that the only way we can move forward as a society is if we take the time to understand each other. She thought about Mark again, sitting in the back of the plane, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. He had been so quick to judge her, so certain that she didn't belong in first class. But maybe, just maybe, if he knew a little more about her, he would see things differently. Maybe he would realize that people like Ava weren't defined by the color of their skin, their gender, or even their job title. They were defined by their character, their actions, and their willingness to stand up for what was right. Ava's thoughts drifted back to her first days in basic training. She had been one of the few women in her unit, and the only black woman. At first, it had been intimidating, walking into a world that was so dominated by men, by people who didn't look like her. But she had quickly learned that strength came in many forms, and that true leadership wasn't about barking orders or flexing muscles. It was about listening, understanding, and building trust. She wrote about the challenges she had faced during her training, the doubts that had crept into her mind when things got tough. There had been days when she had questioned whether she was strong enough, tough enough, to make it. But with every obstacle she overcame, she grew more confident in herself and her abilities. I faced a lot of challenges in my life, both in and out of the military. But each of those challenges has made me stronger, more resilient. I've learned that true strength isn't about being the loudest or the toughest person in the room. It's about knowing who you are and standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard. Ava glanced out the window again, watching the clouds drift by beneath the plane. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the sky. It reminded her of the sunsets she had watched in Afghanistan, those rare moments of peace amid the chaos of war. She had learned to appreciate those moments, to hold on to them when everything else felt overwhelming. She turned back to her notebook, her hand moving steadily across the page. I didn't ask for this first-class seat, but I've earned it, just like I've earned everything in my life. I've worked hard, sacrificed a lot, and faced more challenges than most people will ever know. So when you questioned my right to be here, it wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something bigger. It was about the assumptions we make about each other, the way we judge people based on what we see, without taking the time to understand who they really are. Ava paused, letting those words sink in. She wasn't sure if Mark would ever read this letter, but even if he didn't, it felt good to get it all out. Writing had always been her way of processing the world, of making sense of the things that didn't quite fit. She thought about how the confrontation had shaken her, how it had reminded her of all the times she had been underestimated or dismissed because of her gender, her race, or her position. But she also thought about the strength she had found in those moments, the way she had learned to rise above it, to keep moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to hold her back. Ava's pen slowed as she neared the end of the letter. She wanted to leave Mark with something to think about, something that might spark a change in the way he saw the world. I don't know if you'll ever see me differently after reading this, but I hope you do. I hope you take a moment to reflect on the assumptions you made, and how those assumptions might be holding you back from understanding people who are different from you. We all have our own stories, our own struggles, and our own reasons for being where we are. I just wanted to share a little bit of mine with you. She signed her name at the bottom, then folded the letter carefully and placed it in her lap. For a moment she just sat there, staring at the envelope, unsure of what to do next. Part of her wondered if it was worth giving it to him. Would he even read it? Or would he toss it aside, dismissing her words as easily as he had dismissed her earlier. But Ava knew that this wasn't just about Mark. It was about her, about standing up for herself, about telling her story, even if no one was listening. It was about claiming her space in the world, unapologetically and without fear. With a deep breath, she tucked the letter into her backpack and leaned back in her seat. She would decide what to do with it later. For now, she just wanted to rest. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, this one more severe than the last. The passengers jolted in their seats as the cabin lights flickered momentarily. Ava instinctively tightened her grip on the armrests, though the fear she felt was not for herself. After all, turbulence was nothing compared to the chaos she had endured in Afghanistan. What concerned her was the growing unease she could sense around her, especially in the elderly woman sitting across the aisle. Ava could see the woman's hands trembling as she clutched the seat in front of her, her face pale with fear. The seatbelt light dinged on again, and a ripple of nervous murmurs spread through the cabin. The plane shuddered once more, and the elderly woman let out a soft whimper. Ava knew that feeling, the fear of losing control, of being at the mercy of forces beyond your control. She had experienced it herself during deployments, in moments when everything seemed to hang in the balance. But she had learned how to stay calm, to find her center in the middle of the storm. And right now, she could see that the woman across from her needed that calmness, that reassurance. Leaning across the aisle, Ava spoke softly, her voice steady and calm. "It's okay, ma'am. Turbulence is normal. Just take a few deep breaths. We're going to be fine." The woman's wide eyes met Ava's, and for a moment there was only fear. But as Ava continued to speak gently, offering comforting words, the woman's breathing began to slow. Her grip on the seat loosened slightly, and she nodded, though her hand still shook. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. I don't like flying." Ava smiled softly, her own anxiety easing as she saw the woman start to relax. "You're not alone," she said. "A lot of people don't, but I promise you, we're safe. The pilots know exactly what they're doing." The woman nodded again, though her fear hadn't completely dissipated. Ava could see the tension still etched in her face, the tightness in her posture. But at least now, she wasn't alone in her fear. Ava had given her something to hold on to, a sense of calm in the middle of the turbulence. As the plane steadied, the murmurs in the cabin faded, and passengers began to relax once more. Ava settled back in her seat, her mind still on the elderly woman. It had been a simple act, offering a few words of comfort, but it had reminded her of something important. Even out of uniform, even in the most mundane of situations, she still had the ability to lead, to offer support to those around her. It was part of who she was, a skill she had honed in the military and carried with her into civilian life. Her thoughts drifted back to the battlefield, to the moments when her leadership had been tested in ways far more intense than this. She remembered the day Emma Lopez had saved her life, pulling her out of the line of fire during an ambush. That day had changed her, had solidified her belief in the power of teamwork, of standing strong for those who relied on you. In Afghanistan, she had been a leader not just because of her rank, but because her team trusted her, depended on her to keep them safe. She glanced at the woman across the aisle again, who was now sitting more comfortably, her hands resting in her lap. Ava felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It was small, yes, but she had helped someone today. In the military, that was what leadership was often about. Small moments that could make all the difference in someone's life. Just then, the flight attendant made her way down the aisle, stopping at Ava's seat with a gentle smile. "Everything okay here, Sergeant?" she asked, her eyes flicking briefly toward the elderly woman. Ava nodded. "We're fine now, thank you." The flight attendant's smile widened. "You handled that very well. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, Ava couldn't help but think about how different civilian life was from the military. And yet, in moments like this, it wasn't so different after all. People still needed reassurance, still looked to others for guidance. Whether on a battlefield or on a turbulent plane, the principles of leadership remained the same. Ava settled back into her seat, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. But as her eyes drifted toward the back of the plane, she saw Mark Thompson watching her again. His expression had changed. Gone was the anger, the bitterness that had clouded his features earlier. Instead, he looked thoughtful, maybe even a little ashamed. Ava wasn't sure what to make of it. She had expected him to stay angry, to hold on to the grudge that had fueled their confrontation. But something had shifted. He had seen her help the elderly woman, seen her take control of a situation without hesitation. Perhaps that was the beginning of understanding for him, realizing that she wasn't just some stranger who had taken a seat he thought he deserved. She was someone who had earned her place, who had something to offer the world. Mark quickly averted his eyes when he realized she had caught him staring, and Ava turned her attention back to the window. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the clouds. The peacefulness of the scene stood in stark contrast to the tension that had filled the cabin just moments before, and Ava allowed herself to breathe deeply, to let go of the stress that had built up over the course of the day. She thought again about her military service, about the countless times she had been called upon to lead in moments of crisis. It wasn't always easy, and it certainly wasn't always glamorous, but it was who she had become after years of training, deployments, and experience. And now, even in civilian life, that part of her wasn't going away. Ava glanced down at the notebook in her lap. She had been writing the letter to Mark, pouring her thoughts and feelings onto the page. It had felt cathartic in a way, to put everything down in words. But now, after seeing the shift in his demeanor, she wondered if the letter would even be necessary. Maybe action spoke louder than words. She thought about the lessons she had learned in the military, about how true leadership wasn't about shouting commands or demanding respect. It was about earning trust, about leading by example. Maybe that was what had resonated with Mark. Maybe, in seeing her act without hesitation, he had begun to see her for who she really was. The turbulence had passed, but the impact of the moment lingered. Ava knew that she had changed something, not just in the elderly woman she had comforted, but in the man who had challenged her. And perhaps, in some small way, she had changed something in herself too. She opened her notebook again, glancing over the words she had written. The letter felt right, but something told her that her actions had already started to do the talking. Still, she decided to keep writing, to finish what she had started. Sometimes words were just as important as actions. In the military, we learn to lead by example, she wrote. We learn that our actions speak louder than our words, that the way we treat others can have a lasting impact. Today, I hope I've shown you that I belong here just as much as anyone else. And not because of what I've been through, but because of who I am. She paused, staring at the words for a moment before continuing. I hope that in seeing me today, you've begun to question the assumptions you made about me when we first met. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for understanding, and I believe that's something we can both give each other. Ava closed the notebook and placed it in her lap. The letter wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It reflected who she was, and that was all that mattered. The plane began its slow descent into Chicago, and Ava felt a sense of relief wash over her. Soon, she would be home. Soon, she would be with her family. But in this moment, as the plane gently lowered toward the ground, she felt a sense of closure, not just for the flight, but for the encounter with Mark. As the plane touched down smoothly, Ava gathered her things, her mind still replaying the events of the day. The turbulence had passed, but the lessons from it lingered. As the plane taxied to the gate, the familiar feeling of anticipation began to bubble up inside Ava. She was almost home, just moments away from reuniting with her family, after what felt like a lifetime in Afghanistan. Yet, as much as she longed to step off the plane and embrace her loved ones, her mind couldn't quite let go of the events that had unfolded during the flight. Ava glanced toward the back of the plane, where Mark Thompson was still seated. He was staring out the window, his face etched with something that looked like regret, or maybe confusion. Whatever it wasn't the anger she had seen earlier. That had dissipated somewhere along the way, replaced by something far more complex. And though Ava didn't know what was going through his mind, she had a feeling that their encounter had affected him as much as it had affected her. When the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began to rise from their seats, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Ava stood and reached for her backpack, her thoughts still lingering on the letter she had written. Part of her wondered if she should give it to Mark, or if maybe the moment had already passed. But before she could make up her mind, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she found herself face to face with Mark. His posture was stiff, his eyes slightly downcast, but there was something different about him now. A vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Sergeant Johnson," he began, his voice low and hesitant. I think I owe you an apology." Ava raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the unexpected words. She had braced herself for a silent departure, perhaps a quick, awkward glance as they left the plane. But an apology? That was the last thing she had expected. "You don't have to apologize," Ava said, though her voice softened. "But I appreciate it." Mark shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to get his words out. "No, I do need to apologize," he insisted. "The way I acted earlier, it was out of line. I made assumptions about you that I shouldn't have, and I've been thinking about it the whole flight." Ava studied his face, searching for the sincerity behind his words, and she found it. There, in the way his eyes darted away as if he couldn't bear to meet her gaze fully, and in the way his voice trembled slightly with the weight of his admission. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "It's not easy to admit when we've made a mistake." Mark nodded, exhaling deeply, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. "I've been carrying around a lot of anger for a long time," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother, he was a soldier too. He died in Afghanistan 2 years ago. And I think I've been blaming everyone for that ever since." Ava felt her heart tighten at his words. She hadn't expected that. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, her voice gentle. "That must have been incredibly hard." Mark's eyes remained downcast, his shoulders slumping slightly as he spoke. "It's been tough. Alex, my brother, he was the kind of guy who always did the right thing. He believed in justice, in equality. And I know he wouldn't have approved of the way I acted today. He would have been ashamed of me." Ava's heart went out to him. She understood grief, understood how it could twist someone's actions, make them lash out in ways they never would have otherwise. But hearing Mark speak about his brother, about the weight of that loss, shifted something in her. "Grief can make us do things we wouldn't normally do," Ava said softly. "It can cloud our judgment, make us see the world through a lens of pain. But the fact that you're here now, apologizing, means you're already starting to work through that." Mark finally looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time since the conversation began. There was something raw in his eyes, something fragile, as if he had been holding on to this pain for far too long. "I don't want to be that person anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be angry all the time." Ava nodded, understanding. "It's not easy to let go of anger," she said, "but it's a start. And it sounds like your brother believed in the values that brought us together in the military. Justice, equality, unity. If you want to honor his memory, living by those values is the best way to do it." Mark's eyes filled with tears, though he blinked them back quickly. "You're right," he said quietly. "Alex always believed in doing the right thing, and I haven't been living up to that." Ava felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know Mark's brother, but from the way he spoke about him, she could tell that Alex had been someone who made a real impact on those around him. Someone who, like Ava, had fought for something bigger than himself. "Thank you for telling me about your brother," Ava said. "It sounds like he was an incredible person." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "He was, and I think he would have liked you." Ava smiled, feeling the weight of the conversation settling around them. It wasn't often that people opened up like this, especially after such a difficult confrontation. But here they were, two people from very different walks of life, finding common ground in their shared experiences, their shared loss. As passengers began filing off the plane, Mark cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice a little stronger this time. "I'm part of a veterans support group," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small business card. "We meet a few times a month, just to talk, to help each other adjust to civilian life. I think you'd fit in well with us." Ava took the card, glancing at the details printed on it. It wasn't something she had considered before, joining a support group. But the idea of connecting with other veterans, of sharing her experiences and hearing theirs, felt like something she could use right now. "Thank you," she said, slipping the card into her pocket. "I'll think about it." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "I hope you do. And thank you, Ava, for being patient with me, for helping me see things differently." Ava smiled, a small but genuine one. It's never too late to start seeing things differently. As they both stepped off the plane and into the crowded terminal, Ava felt a strange sense of closure settle over her. What had started as a confrontation had turned into something deeper, something that had left an impact on both of them. She had gone from being an object of scorn in Mark's eyes to someone he respected, even admired. And that, more than anything, felt like a victory. But as Ava made her way through the terminal, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She turned around just in time to see Mark rushing toward her, his carry-on bag bouncing awkwardly at his side. "Ava, wait!" he called, slightly out of breath. Ava stopped, raising an eyebrow as he caught up to her. "What's up?" she asked, curious. Mark stood there for a moment, catching his breath. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card again, but this time he wrote something on the back with a pen. "If you ever need someone to talk to about anything, you can reach out. That's my personal number," he said, handing her the card again. Ava looked down at the card, then back up at Mark. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine offer of friendship. It was a far cry from the man who had confronted her just hours earlier, and it left her feeling hopeful about the change that had taken place between them. "Thanks, Mark," she said, slipping the card into her pocket once more. "I appreciate it." Mark gave her a small awkward smile, then nodded. "Take care, Ava, and welcome home." Ava smiled in return, watching as Mark disappeared into the crowd. It was a simple farewell, but it felt like the beginning of something that went beyond just an apology or an exchange of words. It felt like the beginning of understanding, of healing, not just for Mark, but for Ava as well. As Ava turned and continued toward the baggage claim, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She had expected her return home to be quiet, uneventful, a smooth transition back to normal life. But instead, she had been thrown into a confrontation that had tested her patience, her resilience, and her ability to stay true to who she was. And in the end, it had led to something unexpected, something good. As Ava made her way through the crowded terminal, the reality of being home began to sink in. She was finally back on American soil, away from the constant dangers of deployment, the heat, and the stress of the battlefield. But today, on a simple flight home, she had experienced an unexpected challenge, one that had left her reflecting deeply on the path ahead. She spotted her family from a distance, her father, Robert, standing tall with his usual air of quiet pride, her mother, Sarah, waving excitedly, and her younger brother, Ethan, practically bouncing with excitement. They held a large sign that read, "Welcome home, Ava," adorned with American flags and colorful decorations. Seeing them waiting there for her brought a rush of warmth and relief that made everything else fade into the background. Ava quickened her pace, her heart swelling with emotion. When she finally reached them, her mother was the first to rush forward, enveloping her in a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, you're home!" Sarah exclaimed, tears brimming in her eyes. Ava hugged her mother back just as tightly, feeling the weight of the past 6 months lift off her shoulders. "I missed you, Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her father stepped forward next, pulling her into a strong embrace. "Welcome home, Ava," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "We've missed you." "I missed you too, Dad," Ava replied, smiling through the tears that had begun to blur her vision. Ethan, her younger brother, stood nearby, fidgeting with excitement. Ava turned to him, playfully ruffling his hair. "Hey, Squirt, have you been staying out of trouble?" Ethan grinned, clearly thrilled to have his big sister back. "Only a little bit," he teased. "I've been keeping up with my training, though, just like you taught me." Ava laughed, feeling a sense of normalcy return. It was good to be home, surrounded by the people who loved her, the people who had been waiting for her return. The events on the plane, the confrontation, the letter, Mark's apology, seemed distant now, like something from another world. But they had left an indelible mark on her heart, a reminder of the power of empathy and understanding, even in the most unexpected places. As they made their way out of the airport, Ava couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened that day. Mark's apology had been sincere, and his story about his brother's death had struck a chord with her. She knew how grief could twist a person's perspective, how anger and pain could cloud judgment. But she also knew that healing was possible, that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides. In some ways, today's encounter had reminded her of the values she had fought for in the military: justice, equality, and the strength that came from unity. She hadn't expected to find those lessons on a plane ride home, but life had a way of surprising her like that. As they walked through the parking lot, Ava's father spoke up. "You know, Ava, we've been talking to Mr. Peterson down the street. He runs a security firm, and he's looking to hire veterans. He said he'd love to have you on the team whenever you're ready." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "Thanks, Dad. I'll definitely think about it." Her mother placed a hand on her arm, her expression full of love and concern. "There's no rush, honey. Whatever you decide, we'll support you." Ava smiled, feeling grateful for her family's unwavering support. The idea of joining a veteran support group, as Mark had suggested, was still lingering in her mind as well. Maybe that was the right path for her, at least for now. She didn't have to make any decisions today. For the first time in a long time, Ava felt like she had options. Choices about her future that didn't involve war or combat, but still allowed her to serve in a meaningful way. Later that evening, after settling in at home, Ava found herself sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, a peaceful contrast to the whirlwind of emotions she had experienced earlier in the day. As the cool evening air brushed against her skin, Ava felt a deep sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "Thank you again for everything today. I read your letter, and it really made me think. I'd like to talk more, if you're ever open to it. Take care." Ava stared at the message for a moment, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't expected him to reach out so soon, but his message reaffirmed something she had always believed: that people could change, that understanding and empathy could transform even the most difficult of situations. She typed a quick response. "Thank you, Mark. I'm glad we had the chance to talk. Let's stay in touch." As she set the phone down, Ava took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever her next steps were, whether it was re-enlisting, joining the support group, or taking a civilian job, she knew that she would continue to live by the values she had carried with her throughout her military service: compassion, courage, and the unshakable belief in the power of understanding to bring people together. As Ava's journey comes to an end, her story reminds us of the power of empathy and the importance of looking beyond assumptions to truly understand one another. Her experience on that flight shows that even in moments of tension and conflict, there is room for transformation. It's not always easy, but by embracing compassion and seeking common ground, we can bridge the divides that separate us. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more inspiring content. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder of the power of understanding, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where compassion changed your perspective? We'd love to hear your stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.